Hi, welcome to Chapter 11, Theories of Personality. These are the objectives we'll be covering. And let's first talk about personality. It's important not to, when you're looking at personality, it's the unique and relatively stable ways in which people think, feel, and behave. Both character and temperament are vital parts of personality. However, adult personality is a combination of temperaments, which is enduring characteristics which you're born with, and also a personal history of family, culture, and time, which make up your character, value judgments, and your ethical behavior, according to Kagan, 2010. There's four basic perspectives in the study of personality. There's a psychodynamic perspective, which comes from Freud, behavior perspective, which comes from Skinner's operant conditioning, humanistic perspective, which comes from Carl Rogers, and trait perspective. Let's first take a look at from the psychoanalytical movement. Europe had kind of a negative view during the Victorian age. Men were supposedly unable to control their animal desires. For instance, a good Victorian husband would father several children with his wife and then turn to his mistress for sexual comfort. Women are not supposed to have sexual urges. From Freud, he came up with what's called a preconscious mind, which is a level of the mind in which information is available but not currently conscious. And then the conscious mind is a level of the mind that is aware of immediate surroundings and perceptions. This is my dog. He's drinking some water. That's what that noise is. Good timing, Cooper. Okay. The Neo-Freudian Carl Jung believed that there was not only a personal unconscious mind, but also a collective unconscious, which contained a species memory of ancient fears and themes. Are you done, dog? And also Jung pointed out that the second half of life, we focus on developing our shadow side or undeveloped side of ourselves. This little picture of an iceberg represents the three levels of the mind. There's the part of the iceberg that's visible above the surface is the conscious mind. Just below the surface is the preconscious mind that is not yet part of the conscious mind. Below the surface are the unconscious feelings, memories, thoughts, and urges that cannot easily be brought to consciousness. While two of the three parts of the personality, the ego and the superego, exist at all three levels of awareness, the id is completely in the unconscious mind. To help you understand the ego, the superego, and the id represents basically our selfish desires, also the desire for self-preservation, whereas the ego represents more of our socialized self, about what is best for not myself, but what is best for the group or for society. And then the ego is what balances the two. So the id is the part that's present at birth. And Freud talked about the libido, which is the instinctual energy that comes into conflict with the demands of society standards. So it's our selfish desires. The pleasure principle is a principle by which the ID functions without worrying about consequences. The ego is a part that balances the selfish desires with what society is asking of us, and it considers what's called the reality principle, by which the ego functions, trying to satisfy the demands of the id only when negative consequences will not result. The superego is that socialized self that considers what's best for others and society as a whole. The ego ideal is a part that contains the standards for moral behavior. It's also the part that contains our conscience, that produces pride or guilt depending on how well our behavior matches. If you take a look at psychological defense mechanisms, these are unconscious distortions of a person's perception of reality that reduce stress and anxiety. So these terms came up from basically from Freud's psychoanalysis. First of all, there's denial. That's where a person refuses to acknowledge or recognize a threatening situation. Repression is when the person refuses to consciously remember a threatening or acceptable event, instead pushes those events into the unconscious mind. Rationalization is when we invent acceptable excuses for unacceptable behavior. Projection is when we use unacceptable or threatening impulses or feelings that are seen as originating in someone else, usually the target of the impulses or feelings. Reaction formation is when the person forms an emotional or behavioral reaction opposite to the way he or she really feels in order to keep those true feelings hidden from self and others. Displacement is the redirection of feelings from a threatening target to a less threatening one. And regression is when the person falls back to a childlike pattern of responding in reaction to stressful situations. Identification is when a person tries to become like someone else to deal with anxiety. And compensation or substitution, that's when a person makes up for deficiencies in one area by becoming superior in another. And then sublimation is channeling socially unacceptable impulses and urges into socially acceptable behavior. So Freud's theory talks about fixation. That's if the person does not resolve a conflict in a certain psychosexual stage, they will result in personality traits and behaviors associated with that earlier stage. So that would be also known as regression. Now, when you take a look at psychosexual stages, these are 5 stages of personality. These are 5 stages of personality development proposed by Freud and tied to sexual development of the child. For instance, the oral stage is the first stage, which occurs in the first year of life. This is which the mouth is the erogenous zone and weaning is the primary conflict. The id dominates during this time. Baby's just taking care of its own needs. It's all about himself. They learn everything through the mouth, attaching it to the mouth. So that's why he called it the oral stage. The anal stage is the second stage. This is between 1 and 3 years old, where the child is learning to be potty trained. The anus is the zone, and toilet training is the source of conflict. So they learn to, instead of being selfish and just kind of pooping in their diaper, they learn to poop in the potty to make their parents happy. So it's where the superego is actually starting to come into play, and they're doing something else to please someone else. Freud talks about an anal expulsive personality. This is where a person is fixated in the anal stage, who is messy, destructive, and hostile. The anal retentive personality, if you call someone anal retentive, that means they're fixated on the anal stage, about being neat, fussy, stingy, and stubborn. The phallic stage is the third stage that occurs from 3 to 6 years of age. The child discovers sexual feelings, and the superego develops even more. Freud talks about the Oedipus complex, where it occurs in the phallic stage, in which the male child develops sexual attraction to the opposite sex parent and jealousy of the same sex parent. The Electra complex is a similar process for girls. Now, latency stage is the fourth stage occurring during the school years, which the sexual feelings of the child are repressed while the child develops in other ways. And finally, the genital stage is during and after puberty, where sexual feelings are reawakened with appropriate targets. Now, Neo-Freudians were followers of Freud who developed their own competing theories of psychoanalysis. Jung developed a theory including both a personal and collective unconscious. The personal unconscious was Jung's name for the unconscious mind, described by Freud's collective unconscious by Freud, but the collective unconscious is the memory shared by all members of the human species, which includes archetypes, collective universal human memories. And then developing the shadow side, you've probably heard of, oh, your shadow is coming out. That's basically the undeveloped side of our personality, which we tend to focus on more our second half of life. Alfred Adler proposed that feelings of inferiority are the driving force behind personality. He developed what's called the birth order theory, where firstborn children feel inferior to younger children who receive all the attention. They become overachievers. Middle children feel superior to the dethroned older children as well as younger children. They tend to be very competitive, where younger children feel inferior because they don't have the freedom or responsibility of older children. Karen Horney developed a theory based on basic anxiety. She rejected the concept of penis envy. She said that basic anxiety is anxiety created when a child is born into a bigger and more powerful world of older children and adults. And then neurotic personality is the result of less secure upbringings and paired with maladaptive ways of dealing with relationships. Erik Erikson developed a theory based on social rather than sexual relationships. We covered that pretty much in a previous chapter. The behaviorist view, which stems from Skinner, that behaviorists define personality as a set of learned responses or habits. And a habit is a well-learned response that has become automatic. That personality is just basically a learned response to operant and classical conditioning. Criticism of this theory is that it leaves out the mental processes and social influences of learning. So social cognitive learning, they basically added to the behaviorist view. They emphasize the importance of the influence of other people's behavior and the influence of one's own expectancies on learning. The social cognitive view says that learning theory includes cognitive processes such as anticipating, judging, memory, and imitating of models. Bandura in 1989 believed that three factors influence one another in determining patterns of behavior that make up personality: the environment, personal cognitive factors, and behavior. In his term reciprocal determinism, Bandura explains how environment and these personal characteristics and behavior interact. Self-efficacy is a word that describes an individual's perception of how effective behavior to accomplish a goal will be in any particular circumstance. This is not the same as self-esteem. This is basically how one believes, how good they feel about what they do based on how successful or unsuccessful they've been in the past. For instance, your self-efficacy as a student depends on what kind of grades you get. And if you get good grades, you have a pretty good self-efficacy about your studying skills and your ability to be a student. In Bandura's model of reciprocal determinism, these three factors influence behavior: the environment, which consists of physical surroundings and the potential for reinforcement, and the personal cognitive characteristics that have been rewarded in the past, and the behavior itself, which may or may not be reinforced at this particular time and place. Julian Rotter in 1966 came up with what's called the internal and the external locus of control. Internal locus of control is where you believe you have control over your world, and that's associated with high achievement and motivation. Where external locus of control is where you feel like everything's out of your control, and you're more likely to give up quickly or fall into patterns of learned helplessness, like the dog that experienced shock that no longer jumped because it learned helplessness, or depression. Now, high expectancy is for success is similar to a high sense of self-efficacy and is based on past experiences of success and failure. So if you look at Weiner's attribution theory, if I have an internal locus of control and attributions of no control, I'd focus on ability to make change. Where if I do have control, I'd focus on effort. That effort is what's going to produce results. Where if I have external locus of control, I focus on it's all chance or up to luck. Where the other one, attributions of control, focuses on task difficulty. Carl Rogers in 1961 came up with the humanistic perspective, or this is the third force in psychology. He really focuses on those aspects of personality that make people uniquely human, such as our feelings and our freedom of choice. This is a reaction against the negativity of psychoanalysis, that we're basically, fighting our urges, and also the deterministic nature of behaviorism. It was a whole different approach to counseling and therapy. His theory of personality is based on what's called self-actualization, and that's striving to fulfill one's innate capabilities and abilities. So basically, if our needs are met and we're in a safe environment, we're more likely to become self-actualized. Self-concept is the image of ourself that develops from interactions with other people. So if we interact with other people that make us feel good about ourselves, we have a better concept. Oh, that was a Freudian slip. Self-archetype that works with the ego to manage other archetypes and balance the personality. The real self is one's perception of actual characteristics, traits, and abilities. An ideal self is one's perception of how one would be. For instance, everyone has basically those different selves, the real self and the ideal self. The ideal self is how we would like to be. The real self is how we perceive ourselves to be. And if these two selves are common, then we have what's called congruence. If they're not too common, like I am not like I really wanted to be, then we have what's called incongruence. And the purpose of counseling would be to help kind of match those two up and have congruence between the two views of self. According to Rogers, the self-concept includes the real self and ideal self. The real self is the actual perception of our traits and abilities, whereas our ideal self is a perception of what we would like to be or think we should be. When ideal self and the real self are very similar, they experience harmony and contentment. When there's a mismatch of the two selves, the person experiences anxiety from the incongruence and may engage in neurotic behavior. Rogers' approach was what's called unconditional positive regard, and that's given without conditions or strings attached. Conditional positive regard is given only when a person's doing what the providers of positive regard wish. So it's unconditional love leads to a safe environment, where conditional is more you're safe only if you do these things. Rogers' goal was a fully functioning person who was in touch with and trusting their deepest, innermost urges and feelings. That it wasn't a negative thing like Freud's view of the id, but it was a very natural thing. Current thoughts on the humanistic perspective, they tend to be a little bit too much on the positive side, a little too rosy. It's very difficult to test these theories scientifically. And then we'll talk more about the positive psychology later. Positive psychology has roots in humanistic psychology. They share a focus on human potential, strengths, and positive aspects of being human. And there's a nice little video here on humanistic theories right here. Trait theories from Gordon Allport. He actually experienced therapy from Freud, and he said, Freud's a little bit not quite on track with some of these things. He says he came up with theories that endeavor to describe characteristics that make up human personality in an effort to predict future behavior. He said if you have these traits, they're a consistent, enduring way of thinking, feeling, or behaving. He developed around 200 traits. He believed that these traits were part of the nervous system. Next, Cattell reduced the number of these traits to between 16 and 23 with a computer method called factor analysis. He developed a 16 personality factor questionnaire test. If you want to get an idea of this, go ahead and click this link here. Next, surface traits are aspects of our personality that can be easily seen by other people, where source traits are more basic traits that underlie the surface traits which form the core of our personality. For example, introversion is a source trait, and that's where people tend to withdraw from excessive stimulation. If I'm an introvert, when I'm really tired, I recharge my batteries by being alone. Or if I'm an extrovert, I'd recharge my batteries by interacting with other people. Cattell's self-report inventory. This personality profiles of individuals working in various occupations may be characterized by using such tools as Cattell's 16PF self-report inventory. For example, airline pilots versus writers. Airline pilots, when compared to writers, tend to be more conscientious, relaxed, self-assured, and far less sensitive. I encourage you to watch the movie Sully to get a feel for this personality type. Writers, on the other hand, were more imaginative and better able to think abstractly, based on Cottrell, 1973. This is what's called the Big Five, or the ocean, huge ocean of personality, and it describes the 5 basic trait dimensions. First one is openness, and that's a willingness to try new things and be open to new experiences. Conscientiousness, that's the care a person gives to organization and thoughtfulness of others, and dependability. Extroversion is one's need to be with other people. So extroverts are people who are outgoing and sociable, where introverts are people who prefer more one-on-one conversations, or they prefer solitude and dislike being the center of attention. Now, agreeableness, that's the emotional style of a person that may range from easygoing, friendly, and likable to grumpy, crabby, and unpleasant. And neuroticism is a degree of emotional stability or instability. Now, behavioral genetics is a study of relationship between heredity and personality. Now, we love using identical twin studies and adoption studies to find support for genetic influence. Heritability is how much of the trait can be attributed to genetic influences, and that's the extent to which genetic variation impacts differences in observed behavior. Take a look at this chart here. Identical and fraternal twins differ in the way they express the Big Five personality factors. The scores of identical twins have a correlation of about 50%, whereas those of fraternal twins have a correlation of about 15 to 20%. So this gives support to the idea that some aspects of personality are genetically based. This is from Lowland in 1992. Monozygotic twins, or identical twins, remember they share 100% of their genetic material. So they're really good for comparison studies. So although the Jim twins lived apart, they had exhibited similar traits and habits, which leans towards that genetic disposition for personality. However, their environment, social, economic, and educational experiences were still pretty similar even though they lived apart. So we still have to consider their experience as well. Geert Hofstede, 1980, studied workers in 64 countries across the world and found 4 basic dimensions of personality along which cultures may vary. One is individualism versus collectivism. In our country, we tend to focus on individualism, so it's about specializing and doing the best we can. In other countries, they may focus on collectivism. Like in Japan, they work on cross-training people in all the areas. Instead of specializing, they make sure everybody knows how to do everything. And then there's also the loyalty towards the group, where in the United States, if we get a promotion to work somewhere else, we'll take it, or in Japan, you might be more loyal to your company. Power and distance, that has to do with feeling in control. Masculinity, femininity, definitely some issues with how we should act as male and female. And then uncertainty, avoidance, in the United States, we're not very tolerant of uncertainty, where there's countries that they need to have things really spelled out, and this is the way things are done. Okay, next, Richard Lazarus in 1991 came up with what's called the cognitive appraisal approach. How people think about a stressor determines, at least in part, how stressful that stressor will become. He came up with the terms primary appraisal, which involves estimating the severity of the stressor and classifying it either as a threat or a challenge. Secondary appraisal involves estimating the resources available to the person for coping with the stressor. If you look at this diagram here, according to Lazarus's cognitive appraisal, there's 2 steps in determining the degree of stress created by the potential stressor. The primary appraisal, where they determine the potential stressor is a threat. If it is a threat, the secondary appraisal occurs in addition to the bodily and emotional reactions. Do you remember that we talked about that in the previous session? Secondary appraisal involves determining the resources that has to deal with stress, such as time, money, physical ability, and so on. Inadequate resources lead to increased feelings of stress and a possibility of developing new resources to deal with the stress. Meyer Friedman and Ray Roseman in 1974 wrote a book called Type A Behavior in Your Heart. And they delineate 3 types of personalities. The Type A personality is pretty much your workaholic, ambitious, time-conscious, hardworking, tends to have high levels of hostility and anger, easily annoyed. Where the Type B personality is relaxed, laid back, less driven, slow to anger. The Type C is pleasant but repressed, especially when it comes to anger and anxiety and expressing feelings. They tend to have higher cancer rates. And then the 4th type, which was added, was called the hardy personality. They seem to thrive on stress, but lack the anger and hostility of the Type A personality. They have a deep commitment to values and sense of control. They have a mission in life, and they view problems as challenges to be met and answered. So the 2 bars on the left represent men with Type A personalities. Notice that within the Type A men, there are more than twice as many who suffer from coronary heart disease than those who are healthy. The 2 bars on the right represent men with Type B personalities. Far more Type B personalities are healthy than Type A personalities. And there are fewer Type B personalities with coronary heart disease when compared to the Type A personalities. This is from Miller et al. 1991. Now, when you look at these styles, you notice that optimists tend to expect positive outcomes, pessimists expect negative outcomes. If you're an optimist, you're more likely to develop, or less likely to develop learned helplessness and ignore your health and become depressed. Where if you feel like you're not in control, you might be more likely to give up, not take care of yourself, and become depressed. Next is the interview. Personality interviews, we can do what's called a personality assessment, in which a professional asks a question of the client and allows the client to answer, either in a structured or unstructured fashion. Sometimes there's a problem with what's called the halo effect, and that's a tendency of an interviewer to allow the positive characteristics of a client to influence assessments of the client's behavior and statements. Direct observation is where the professional observes a client engage in ordinary day-to-day behavior in either a clinical or a natural setting. Rating scales is where we use a numerical value assigned to specific behaviors that's listed in the scale. Frequency count is the assessment in which the frequency of a particular behavior is counted. Here are some personality inventories. This could be a paper, pencil, or computerized tests that consists of statements that require standardized responses. There's a NEO-PI, which is based on the 5-factor ocean model. I like the Myers-Briggs type indicator. It's based on Jung's theory of personality types, introvert, extrovert, intuitive, feeling, sensate, thought, and perceptive and judgmental. Then there's the MMPI-2, which is designed to detect abnormal behavior, thinking patterns, and personality. That's a Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory. So by answering questions, they can get an idea what mental health issues you might be struggling with. Click this link to take your own personality inventory. This link right here. Rorschach ink block tests. This is used more by psychoanalysis theory. And it's a projective test that uses an ink block, and they tell you, what do you see? And they're hoping that you come up with what's called your unconscious thoughts through these things. Then there's a thematic apperception test. It's a projective test that uses pictures of people in ambiguous situations as visual stimuli. So this is a Rorschach ink blot, and a person being tested is asked to tell the interviewer, what do you see here? And the answers are neither right or wrong, but they may reveal unconscious concerns. So what do you see in this ink block? This sample from the thematic apperception test, when you look at this picture, what story does this suggest to you? Who is this person and why is he climbing the rope? Next is projection, and that's where it's a defense mechanism involving placing or projecting one's own unacceptable thoughts onto others, as if thoughts actually belong to those others and not oneself. Projective tests are personality assessments that present ambiguous visual stimuli to the client and ask the client to respond with whatever comes to their mind. Problems with these projective tests, one is they are subjective. They rely on concepts and impressions that are only valid within a particular person's perception. It may be influenced by biases, prejudice, and personal experiences. With no standard grading scales, projective tests are low in reliability and validity. And finally, who uses what method? Psychoanalysts tend to use what's called projective tests to figure out a personality, where humanistic therapists tend to use just interviews, where behavioral and social cognitive therapists will use direct observation, rating scales, and frequency counts, where trait theorists will use these the 16 personality theory, the Myers-Briggs, Keirsey temperament disorder, or the MMPI. That concludes this unit. Have a great week.